Hello. So I'm quite excited for this stream today because as I was driving over a bridge, which bridged an interstate highway on my way to a coffee shop for said cup, a thought reoccurred to me that has been perpetually dripping for a few months. And that is the thought of pattern and how patterns show up. There we go. Pattern and how patterns show up. So, obviously, in this little corner of the internet, those who listen to Paul Vanderklay will follow Jonathan Peugeot, will have some segmented interest in Jordan Peterson, and figures like these have noticed, probably, that the axis of discussion, the pivot of discourse, has turned in the direction of patterns that range over instances. I will say it that way. Patterns that range over instances from a discussion about what things are made of, where things come from. So that transition is of interest to me. And I would say, as a preliminary, the transition should be noted from a discussion about where things come from, what they are made of, into a discussion of how patterns range over instances. And another way of compressing the language, the words of patterns ranging over instances, a way of compressing all those words with all their different meanings into a shorthand would be, I think, to say examples. Because take apart the word example. You have the prefix ex and then ample. So you're taking an amplification out of something. You're taking the air out of the balloon, simply put. But when you put the air in the balloon, you're not exampling, because exampling would be to, I'm punning now, but exampling would be to take the air out of the balloon. We could go a little further with this. You have air in a balloon, and you want to now take, for example. So what do? You take the air out of the balloon into your mouth, down into your lungs, and then you speak the example, which is a heightened language, and it sounds different than normal speak. And so when someone says, after a proposition that they ask you to be persuaded by and believe in, they'll say, now take, for example, and you can already tell you're being shifted a register. You are being shifted a register, just like when someone takes the air from a balloon and then speaks, and it's very high pitched and sounds odd until it's gone. That area circumscribed by the example someone gives to illustrate their point, after they've articulated a proposition they want you to be persuaded by, and then they come out of it, out of the example, back into propositional speech. We can tell rhetorically we're being taken to a different place rather abruptly. Well, that should be noted. So if we're not taking the air out of something, we are inducing, in being inductive, going from the particular to the universal, one might say. So what would be an example of that? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ... And by that ... we are given to understand an infinite progression of the real number line. But isn't it interesting how all we have to do to signal that shift, that transition, is to simply put 3 dots after a number. Now, what's the significance of those 3 dots? Well, it's nothing inherent to either the first dot, the second dot, or the third dot. Just as there's nothing inherent in putting the dots after 5 or 4 or 3 or 2, just as long as you don't, or maybe you could put them after the 1. So the fact that the 3 dots there at the end aren't there because they're trying to show us where they came from or what they're made of, but they are there to signal a pattern ranging over instances. In this little corner, I think we've moved from, well, what's the evidence for that? Into, show me. Show me that what you are saying holds more than the breath on your lips. If it holds anything more than the breath on your lips, it's bound to be good for something other than the passage of air. And call it, we have more found time through the efficiency of technologies doing most of our work for us, that we are willing to countenance people painting pictures with their vowels and consonants rather than getting to the point and showing the origin of things. This trade-off of the machines or recorded history cutting corners for us, the trade-off from that, yes, we don't really know how our washing machine works, but we have the found time to let unfold ways of speaking and, moreover, ways of seeing, moreover, ways of embodying configurations or embodying patterns ranging over instances. In other words, living in, through, and for examples. If postmodernity is just one balloon after another with high-pitched voices showing that the air doesn't really belong in any of these vessels, then perhaps the metamodern is to show that taken together, these different vessels can be ordered and delivered and refreshed in different containers without loss of meaning, if and only if what is being transferred cooperatively. Yeah. So that leads me to the title of this video, corresponding structures. As I was driving over that bridge, over the interstate, I was thinking to myself, there has to be a way to talk about what language does without vowels and consonants. There has to be a way to relate icons with the pictorial in all its forms and the graphic, the written, and then with the sound, and then with the eye, and then with the body, and then with ritual procedural movement. There has to be a way to relate these things without taking the air out of one and superfying the other with it, because then that would be to be divisive. It would be to have the image make war with the spoken, or the spoken to make war with the image. And as the one diminishes, the other increases, or as one decreases, the other increases. But how could they be in harmony? Or how could they be united without confusion? This brought me to a discussion I had with someone about computer science. But before I go there, it doesn't matter what order I go in. I want to distinguish the language of correspondence from the language of structure. And I do think it is important not to conflate these two languages. Now, here, language is an umbrella term for spoken and unspoken, i.e., gestural. So a play without words could still count for language. And then the question, to my mind, would be, is this language at this instant put forward to be a language of correspondence, or is it put forward to be a language of structure? Now, what do I mean by structure? What do I mean by correspondence? I will start with correspondence. Take, for example, someone who is a bird watcher. They go out with binoculars and a notebook. And with the notebook and pen clicking away, they cite, identify, and record the name of the bird they see. And then they move on until they've named the birds. That obviously is a language of correspondence. Another example, although it might be harder to see, but I would claim is a language of correspondence, is music theory. The moment someone goes out into sound and starts intentionally recognizing patterns that differentiate themselves, sort of sort themselves out from other patterns without striking them or dragging them away, pieces of them away, and can go together like a flock of similar feather. And just like birds flying and migrating, when one moves, the others follow, but they don't bump into each other. So too, the music theorist can tell you different bars, different techniques, different tonal ranges, in ways of constructively and destructively interfering with those givens without turning what they're doing into noise generation. But even having a place for noise, without that noise infecting the other decibel configurations. So a music theorist is a kind of bird watcher. A bird watcher is a kind of music theorist, because both are participating in or both are trying to locate the patterns ranging over the instances of corresponding entities or corresponding endpoints. Both are speaking more or less correspondingly. All right. And this might be, by the way, where we get our language of standards from. Because when someone says, look at the ant, oh, you sluggard, quoting Proverbs, they're holding up this small creature as a standard for some virtue. And in doing that, they are not making it about the creature. They're making it, this is the meta-modern and not the postmodern. They're making it about the rhetorical act itself of using the endpoint of the game of the language of correspondence to refer to this thing which is outside the game and can't be measured by the game, i.e., a virtue. And I think all the virtues are in a suite that cannot be broken into. No part of it can be stolen from a game. Virtues, in other words, cannot be gamified. They can't be grifted. So one way to speak of the virtues and how to cultivate them without making it a game that can be gamified, which would then run against the grain of acquiring the virtue itself, but rather would run into the ground and through the mire of the vice, which is the opposite of the virtue. Sometimes when we gamify the cultivation of a virtue, we unwittingly enter into our tragedy of acquiring the vice instead. So, how do you cultivate and learn, moreover, how to cultivate a given virtue without falling prey to game theory or gamification? Well, you present the possible game in the language of correspondence. And what would you say? Have it break itself or show that it can't be participated in so it repels you back into something? Well, let's take that example of the go to the ant, oh you sluggard. And then what does it say about the ant? What does it predicate about the ant, the creature, the endpoint of the language of correspondence? It says, he gathers his food in summer for winter. So in summer, when the food is present, he gathers in anticipation for when it will not be present. So be like the ant. Why? Because you want food all year round. Why? Oh, my Mac will sleep soon unless I plug it in. I didn't gather electrons this morning for this laptop, and so I should have went to the ant to make sure my battery wouldn't die. Goodness sakes. Let's see. I'll plug it in. Oh well. We'll just see how it goes. So part of what it does is it shows you that the object to which it refers as the endpoint of the language of correspondence is an instance of a pattern that ranges not only over the class of ants, but a class of something larger than ants. And that's why they chose the ant. In other words, it takes that endpoint and isn't concerned with where it came from or what it is made of, but uses it in order to go beyond it to show you where it can belong without destroying it or without it having to become something other than it is. In other words, the way to go beyond the language of correspondence is to understand the need for coherence, generally speaking. If two propositions that fall under the language of correspondence can belong together, there has to be a third thing which is greater than the two of them that allows them room to fit, interestingly and helpfully, and also in ways we cannot imagine yet. This prepares for the future. So the ant is there in the proverb, I would say, in this language of correspondence that goes beyond itself, to show us that even something small, nearest the ground, It's not going to fly like a bird. It's not going to ever lift off. As close to the ground and as small of body as a living thing to my eye can be. An ant is even smaller than your eye. Even that thing can live year round and can prepare its future. So if that is true of something so basic, so fundamental, so elemental, you could think of it in this language as he's describing the atom in the universe, an ant in the field. These two examples, atom in the void, ant in the field, they map onto each other. Preserving structure so that the choice of the ant as an instance of this pattern that all things are providentially watched over prepares us not only to receive a moral lesson, it's good to prepare for the future, but also allows us to see that the universe we're trying to prepare for a future in is one also governed by providence, which means it's coherent, which means we're not on our own. Because in many ways, we're like the ant, very close to the ground. We can only look up from here, but that's all right. Because even the ant, which is much further down from us, can only look up from there. It has this whole game of the cosmos figured out for itself. So surely we can too. And that takes the whole question of how do we provide for ourselves. And do you notice it drops it pretty low on the register? Therefore, now we can find corollaries in Scripture symbolically, because we're talking beyond the language of correspondence, not just where things come from or what they're made of, but we can now start to see a language of structure. And structure is the language that furnishes analogies. An analogy is not the identification of cause before effect or effect from cause. Analogy is the exponent, the higher power, the multiplication of two structures operating and finding the bridge between them, which is to say the way they can be not interchanged, but the way they both can represent something greater than themselves without losing themselves, but not step on each other's toes. That's a structure preserving map in the language of group theory and mathematics, but also it applies to hermeneutics. And it applies to symbolic interpretation. And this is where I think our little corner is going, especially meta-modern wise, not lost in the endless ironies that chew on their own tail known as postmodernity. Postmodernity got us beyond the simple language of correspondence. But after you leave that, you have to see there's something waiting on the other side, which is the language of structure that allows you to go back into the language of correspondence, back to the ants in the field, and make use of them without destroying them, without being ideologically bent to one side or the other. But you can start to see how there is space provided, and you can learn by leaping and going from one to the other. But it requires rules, and it requires not being always precise, but it requires virtue. It requires the virtues. So it's no wonder then that you could find as a corollary in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says, do not be anxious about your life, he chooses something also that is very small and close to the ground, i.e. the lily of the field. And what does he say? He says it neither toils nor spins. So you see the constant here? Like the ant in the book of Proverbs, it's something small and close to the ground. It can only look up from here. And the variable he introduces to that given, while still preserving the structure of why the ant was chosen, he's not doing the language of correspondence, he's doing the language of structure. The little variable he puts on it is the lily doesn't even toil. It doesn't gather for winter in summer. And it doesn't spin. It doesn't work at all. And yet Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these. And if you've read about Solomon in the Bible, you know that he did a lot of work, cognitively and materially. A lot of work. And yet he was not arrayed like one of these. So the language of structure is telling us, there is providence patterning over these things. And so he can say, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will wear, but seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. So this language of analogy, which is an exponent of the language of structure, which is all about preserving maps between things that we just want to identify like a bird watcher or put in a definition like a music theorist. Once we build up those virtues, and they're not just cognitive, they're experiential, they're through patience, they're through ritual practice, they're through community, all these things. One begins to see how things are related without destroying each other or taking away from each other. And that's where I'll leave this video. So in summary, we talked about the language of correspondence and the language of structure, and how analogy comes from the latter, and our identifications can come from the former. And you need both. And from both, you can begin to build understandings that do not rely on cause and effect, that do not rely on having a microscope nearby, but rely on a different kind of microscope, a different kind of polished glass. They rely on the cultivation, which is not a gamification, but a cultivation of the virtues, which is very much like a garden inside one, that one, through the magnification of attention, can begin to see in all its intricacies, blooming, growing, waiting, needing water. And thank God we don't have to do it on our own. These things can be joined like a community garden by the community that we happen to find ourselves in. That's all.